we were talking, Kelsey was saying, hey, she talked to other teammates about, hey, let's all coming back and being here and things like that. Did you have similar conversations with teammates about getting back as a group?
1,000%. I think when you have a team like last year, it's just so special. And you realize when people are healthy, what we can do here in Indiana. And so, of course, we're all trying to keep our core together. And, we're so blessed to have a new CBA that allows us to make more money and to have a lot more benefits. And so, teams have already established those, like, how can we bring all these players back and put them underneath that new umbrella? And so, those defense that needs to work out, but at the end of the day, like, we're all pretty much back, and so we have new people who are going to help us, and it was a fun off season, but I'm glad that our core is back.
That right there is not a press conference answer. That is not something a publicist typed up at midnight and handed to a player before media day. What you just watched is a woman who spent 6 months grinding through one of the most isolating stretches of her entire professional career. A major knee injury during free agency, during the most watched WNBA season in the history of the league. And then came back and told the entire internet exactly where it went wrong. My name is Dre Fiver. This is Dre Hoops. And if you think you already know this story, I promise you, you don't. Because what happened inside that Indiana Fever training facility this week said more about where this team is headed than any contract announcement, any roster move, or any highlight reel possibly could. We are going deep today. Let's get into it. Before we get to the drama, before we get to Caitlin Clark doing things in a shooting drill that made an entire gym go quiet, you have to understand what Sophie Cunningham actually went through to get back to that facility. Because most people skip that part entirely and jump straight to the contract controversy. Sophie didn't tweak her knee, she didn't miss a few games with soreness and come back refreshed. She tore her MCL, a significant structural injury that ended her debut Indiana season in August, and then had to navigate one of the most awkward professional situations imaginable. She was rehabbing and simultaneously a free agent at the same time. Teams wanted to evaluate her. She couldn't put together a full uninterrupted week of on-court work to show anyone. The doctors had the numbers, the scans looked good, but as Sophie said herself, if you're not physically in front of people, those numbers only go so far. Organizations start wondering whether you're actually healthy, so she was negotiating her future while trying to prove her present, and those two timelines almost never line up cleanly. She told reporters at camp that she felt like she got cleared 10 different times because the medical staff kept being extra thorough before giving her the full green light. And even once she was fully cleared in February and started ramping up, pick up games, one-on-one, 3-on-3 sessions, working back toward game speed. She was honest about the mental side being harder to measure than the physical. Your brain remembers exactly what it felt like when the knee gave out. That memory doesn't disappear just because the tissue heals. There were days where the body was responding fine and the instincts were still lagging behind, still doing micro check-ins on cuts she didn't need to hesitate on. And the moment she described as the real turning point, the moment she knew she was actually back, not just cleared on paper, wasn't a scan, wasn't a doctor's signature, wasn't a medical clearance form. It was a pickup game where she made a hard cut, landed clean, and only after the play did she realize she hadn't thought about the knee once during it. That's the marker, not the paperwork. When the brain stops narrating the body's every move, that's when you're genuinely back. Now here's where the story takes a turn, because while Sophie was doing the quiet, unglamorous work of getting herself back to basketball shape, the internet decided it already had a narrative ready to go. She made some honest comments on her own podcast about the contract process. There's a completely reasonable moment of transparency from someone who just navigated an impossible situation, and accounts on Twitter ran with it, chopped the clip, stripped the context, and suddenly the story being spread everywhere was that Sophie was unhappy in Indiana, that the Fever were underpaying her, that she basically felt disrespected by the organization. None of that was what she said, none of it was what she meant, but by the time she arrived at training camp, it had already done damage. She addressed it directly and without hesitation. Her exact message was plain. It was never about the money. She had multi-year offers from other teams. She had options. The frustration was always about contract length, not the dollar amount, because she's almost 30 years old and she wants to establish a home somewhere. Those are two completely different conversations, term versus dollars, and social media happily collapsed them into one because nuance doesn't perform as well as drama. As Dre, I'm going to say this clearly, the accounts that ran with that story knew what they were doing. They took an honest moment from a real person and turned it into a locker room controversy that never existed, and Sophie was not about to let that sit unanswered when it was pointed at a team she genuinely cares about. What was actually happening behind the scenes while all of this noise was spreading? Indiana's front office was doing exactly what a good front office should do. They were evaluating every available option before locking the roster in. General Manager Amber Cox was running the numbers on other free agent targets to see if the cap math could work. It couldn't, not at the prices those players were asking. Once those doors closed, Sophie's deal came together. The delay had nothing to do with wavering on her. It was due diligence, plain and simple. And when you factor in what the Fever are building toward financially, to worse, with Caitlin Clark approaching a massive contract escalation under the new CBA, and Aliyah Boston already locked into the largest total contract in NBA history at $6.3 million over 4 years, the front office needed to be precise with every dollar spent. Sophie's team-friendly one-year deal keeps Indiana positioned to run it back with the full core intact when those bigger numbers hit in 2027. That kind of front office discipline never makes headlines when it goes right. It only gets attention when it blows up. Now let me explain why keeping Sophie Cunningham specifically, and not just any wing player, matters so much to what Stephanie White is trying to build. Because this is where the basketball conversation gets real. White has been direct heading into 2026 about wanting Indiana to crack the top 3 defensively in the league and generate more fast break opportunities off stops. The 2025 Fever ranked 7th defensively. That is not a small gap to close, and it is not going to close itself just because the roster looks good on paper. You need specific players who generate that style of play naturally, not ones who have to think about it. Sophie shoots off movement, guards multiple positions, pushes pace naturally, and this is the part that doesn't show up anywhere in a box score. She creates defensive problems for opponents trying to solve Caitlin Clark at the same time. When Clark has the ball and draws defensive attention, every player around her needs to be an immediate threat the moment she kicks it out. Sophie shooting off screens and cuts creates exactly that problem. A defender can't sag off Cunningham to help contain Clark's drives, because she will punish them from 3, and if they stay attached to her, Clark gets a clear lane to the rim. There is no good answer for a defense trying to solve both problems simultaneously. You don't disrupt that system for a player who needs ISO time and post touches. You protect it. And then there's the other thing Sophie brings, the thing the stat sheet can't hold. Her reputation as the player who makes the rest of the league think twice before getting physical with Clark was established immediately and emphatically in her very first season. During a June 2025 game against the Connecticut Sun, JC Sheldon and Marina Mabrey got physical with Clark in a way that went beyond hard basketball. Sophie's response was not delayed, and it was not subtle. She grabbed Sheldon and threw her down on a layup attempt, took the flagrant foul, got ejected, and didn't flinch about a single second of it. The message to every other team in the league was delivered in real time. If you take a cheap shot at Clark, the bill comes due immediately. What separates Sophie's edge from simple recklessness is the control behind it. She earned a Taekwondo black belt as a young child, and that's not a fun biographical footnote. That's decades of training in how to read physical confrontation, respond with precision, and stay mentally composed when someone is trying to get under your skin. She doesn't lose her cool. She doesn't foul out in the fourth quarter when the Fever need her on the floor. The discipline is built in, and that combination of toughness and self-control is genuinely hard to find in a player who also needs to function as a shooting threat on a team with championship aspirations.
On the way is good. No foul is called, and now tempers are flaring. Aisha Hines-Allen has to be held back by Natasha Cloud. Vanessa Nygaard and Mike Tebow asking for calmer heads to prevail. Diana Taurasi getting involved, saying, "Hey, Coach Tebow, your player fouled our player." So she steps over Sophie right there. But she steps into her. Watch her hip. Hip goes right there into her. No foul is called. Then she steps over her. And a little comeback from Sophie, but she's not going to back down last year.
Now Indiana has added Maisha Hines-Allen to that same locker room, and for those who don't know the history, Sophie and MHA have had their own moment. Back in 2022, Cunningham hit a 3 while Hines-Allen was closing out. MHA deliberately stepped over her on the way back up the floor, and Sophie was in her face within seconds. Chest to chest, screaming. Neither one backed down until they were physically separated. That's not mild competitive friction. That is two players with serious edges going directly at each other. Now they're wearing the same jersey, and when Sophie was asked about Hines-Allen at camp this week, she didn't tiptoe around it. She called her a monster, said she's thrilled they're finally on the same side, and said she thinks MHA feels the same way. Dre's take? Two enforcers who once wanted to fight each other are now protecting the same star. That is genuinely terrifying for the rest of the league. Monique Billings rounds out that new front court picture. Sophie called her an absolute stud and raved about her athleticism. And having watched Billings operate last season, the praise is deserved. Billings brings size, rim running, and the kind of physical rebounding presence that Indiana missed badly during their 2025 playoff run. The new additions don't just fill roster spots, they plug specific holes that were visible on film when the Fever's season ended. And now we get to what Sophie actually saw when she walked back into that practice facility. And this is the part of the story that I think explains everything. Everything about why she came back. Everything about why Kelsey Mitchell stayed. Everything about why this group chose each other again in a league where rosters reshuffle constantly and the money is always tempting someone somewhere else. Sophie Cunningham walked into training camp after 6 months away from competitive basketball. Well, just 6 months of plyometrics, pickup games, rehab sessions, mental grinding. And on day one, Caitlin Clark was in a shooting drill doing something that made the gym stop. Now, here's what Sophie actually told reporters, and I want you to pay attention to how she said it, because the way someone talks when they've actually seen something real is different from how they talk when they're doing a teammate promo. She said Clark has been back. She said it like it was obvious, like the whole world should already know this. She said that anytime Clark is on the floor, she makes everyone around her better. She said Clark is in MVP form, and she didn't reach for careful language or diplomatic phrasing. She just reported what she saw, the same way you'd tell someone what the weather is like outside. That's not hype. That's someone who came back from a long absence and had the answer delivered to her on day one. What makes Clark's camp performance especially significant is the context of where she's coming from. She appeared in only 13 games during the 2025 season due to a series of injuries. She watched most of that playoff run from the sideline. She came back for Team USA work during the offseason, and then she spent months treating every individual workout like it was game prep. She told reporters at camp that she feels healthy, that she put herself in position to be as ready as possible physically, and that she's the kind of person who doesn't want to sit out a single rep. Coming in leaner than last year was a deliberate choice, building her body for the full 44-game grind of a regular season, rather than the short explosive burst she wasn't able to sustain in 2025. And according to Sophie, that preparation is visible from the moment she steps onto the floor. The passing has always been what separates Clark from almost everyone else at her position, but Sophie describes specific moments in camp where Clark throws passes that leave veteran players scrambling, not off target, the opposite. Clark sees the angle a full 2 seconds before anyone else does. And by the time you've processed where the ball is going, it's already arrived. You're standing there watching it happen in real time, and your brain is still catching up. Here's the full picture of what walked through the door when Indiana Fever training camp opened. Clark healthy, confirmed, and by Sophie's account in MVP form. Aliyah Boston on the largest contract in WNBA history and back to full strength. Kelsey Mitchell, one of the most dangerous guards in this league, locked in for one more year to stay in the same cap position as her teammates heading into 2027. Lexi Hull back in the Tres Leches wing group that took a full season to build. Monique Billings and Maisha Hines-Allen adding front court size and physicality the 2025 team didn't have. Tyasha Harris and Raven Johnson bringing defensive pressure at guard that takes real load off Clark and Mitchell. And Sophie Cunningham, cleared, healthy, motivated, and back in a building where she told reporters she fell in love with basketball again. That is not a hopeful projection about what this team could become. Yes, that is what showed up to the first day of camp. You've always saw him. Kelsey Mitchell explained why she stayed by talking about her relationships with Boston, Clark, Hull, and Sophie, and calling it a family vibe she couldn't shake loose. Aliyah Boston said Indy is such a cool place to be and that she loves playing with these people, and asked rhetorically why she would ever want to leave. Sophie said when you find a group that makes you fall in love with basketball again, you hold on to it. 3 players, 3 separate quotes, 1 consistent answer. That doesn't happen by accident. That is a locker room culture that is genuinely real, and you can tell the difference between that and a PR talking point if you've been around sports long enough. The 2025 Fever came agonizingly close. They pushed the Las Vegas Aces to a deciding 5th game in the semifinals. Sophie told reporters this week that getting that close made the loss hurt even more, because when you can almost touch it, the taste it leaves doesn't go away easily. That taste has been sitting in that building all off season, and based on everything that came out of training camp this week, it has been the single most motivating thing in the room since the day they started working again.